Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me all right this way? So since this is being video recorded, I need to stay pretty much here. Usually I like to wander around, but I'm going to practice mindfulness in the standing position here. So I really gave myself a challenge. I said that I was going to present an overview of major insights that have come out of my research connected to the strengths perspective over the course of my career, which in terms of being a professor, that's 33 years, and I have an hour to do it. So that was a good exercise in setting priorities. What might be the most useful to share with you? So everything that I talk about has been stimulated in some way by the strengths perspective. And I've just picked a few of my areas of work to illustrate how the strengths perspective has taken shape in my work, which has had a lot to do with intersections between spiritual and cultural diversity. And I'm going to be applying that to looking at the way people can take on life as opportunity for growth and transformation, even through the experience of crisis, illness, and disability. So what I'm going to do is first provide an overview of key insights from my career. As I explained, I started at University of Iowa for 3 years and then here for 30 years. And I'm going to draw a lot on the wisdom traditions of East and West. So I'm not going to present formal details about my research methods and the kind of things you would read in my published articles in a technical manner. What I want to do is highlight what I think are some very important life insights that have existential import for anyone, hopefully. And doing that by drawing on symbols and stories that come out of my research, but also from various wisdom traditions. So I'm going to start with talking about spiritually sensitive and culturally appropriate practice. And then the next topic is growth through chronic illness and disability. And then close with talking about mindfulness as mindfulness, and then a brief summary and then discussion. So actually, now that I've gone through 33 years of my career and I look back, I realize what I'm going to share with you is nothing new at all. In fact, it's ancient. And I realize that a lot of what I've done in my personal life and my work is more a matter of reminding and reconnecting with core human insights and trying to bring that into social work. So, for example, I grew up with the story of the phoenix. Maybe many of you have also. The phoenix story is about a bird that ends up being consumed in flames and then springing into new life out of its own ashes. I think that's a really nice metaphor for what I'm going to talk about, that even when we go through experiences that can be quite intense, periods of crisis, chaos, adversity, life disruption, that's anyway the possibility, certainly not a guarantee, but a possibility for transformation and leaps forward in our growth. So I am going to be talking about some significant life and death issues, and I realize these may pertain to our own experiences. So as I talk, pay attention to your own feelings that arise and take care of yourself as needed. And for me as well, sometimes it's pretty intense to talk about it, and I'm going to blend personal stories along with my formal work. So to put it in a nutshell, here's my message in brief. The first part shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Life is a limited condition. And this might be a little bit more of a surprise. It's a limitless opportunity. So it's a limited condition, but a limitless opportunity. So my talk is how to take advantage of that limitless opportunity. The reason for doing that is to promote awareness and openness to such a growth-oriented way of life so the general public and clients can be aware of the opportunity and choose it if they wish. And so social workers and other helping professionals can be open and supportive of people's full developmental possibilities, supporting optimal potential for clients in whatever their situation according to their priorities, and promote conditions of well-being and social and environmental justice that are crucial for that growth. But I want to start with a couple of cautions and keep these in the back of your mind as I continue. Even though I'm going to talk about ways of transforming and growing through adversity and life difficulties, I'm not trying to hold up some sort of comic book superhero standard that we're supposed to live to. And sometimes I think that happens. We hear a sort of superficial portrayal of just keep a positive attitude or work hard and you can come through anything. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about each of us in whatever our life circumstances, ordinary, extraordinary, that we can find ways of using that for transformation and growth. It's also not about pushing people to live this way. So I'm not assuming, let's say working with clients, everyone at any particular moment wants to engage that way, but if they do, if they're on that journey, we can be supportive of that. It's also not about blaming people for their experience of obstacles and oppressions when they're not attaining goals they would like to. Rather, we need to identify and target those obstacles and oppressions and change them in order to support people on their journeys. So what I hope this actually is supporting people in all their circumstances, even when we're down and out, and also when ready to move up and through those circumstances. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to express some thanks for a couple of reasons. One is I want to appreciate some of the key figures whose teachings and support inspired my career, and also it conveys along the way some of the ideals and aspirations that have guided me. So, of course, thanks to the KU School of Social Welfare, that has provided me a wonderful academic home for 30 years, and including thanks to all of my colleagues and current and former students. In fact, you'll notice, many of you will notice, that the kinds of work that I'm sharing with you, most of it is collaborative, and some of you in this room have been supportive and inspiring to that. Especially I want to thank in memory Dean Emerita Ann Weick and Emeritus Professor Dennis Salibi. Ann was the recent dean when I came here. I had gotten to know them in a few years before I came through conferences, and I really was moved by their commitment to promoting innovative challenges to conventional thinking, and that's what drew me to come to KU. So as it happened, I came right in 1989 when that first article was published that coined the phrase strengths perspective in the way that our school was developing it. And also thanks to Dean Carney for supporting me and my transition and your continued support of the school. Before I came into social work, my background was in cultural anthropology, especially anthropology of religions and East Asian philosophy, and then comparative religious studies. I've really been fortunate to have wonderful mentors. First, I'm mentioning Professor Emeritus Dongjun Lee at Sungkyunkwan University. He started as my mentor in East Asian philosophy in 1976, and it's so wonderful that he's continued to be my mentor and friend ever since. And in fact, his oldest daughter, who's also a philosopher, is here as a visiting scholar now, so I'm very happy about that. So he taught me a lot about what a scholar should be, which I never learned in my regular Western education. I learned what an academic should be, but not what a scholar should be. And so coming from the Confucian tradition, he taught me that the life of a scholar should be a path dedicated to continuous personal and professional learning, in order to help cultivate personal and global conditions of benevolence, well-being, and justice for everyone and everything. That's a tall order, but it's been something that has served as an aspiration for me. And also in 1980, when I first came into social work as a student at Ohio State, I was so lucky to come the same year that Professor Daniel Budok Lee came as a faculty member, and he became my mentor in social work and continues to serve in that capacity. He taught me especially that social work should promote a transcultural perspective that honors all aspects of human differences and diversity, deeply engages our common humanity, and humbly seeks mutually beneficial connections and collaborations for worldwide well-being. So back at my 60th birthday party in Korea, Professor Lee and his wife are depicted there in the bottom left, and then I'm surrounded by my wife Hija, a couple of my relatives, and a host of former students and visiting scholars who are professors in Korea, and that's a really wonderful thing. So I have some very interesting Korean karma that my life has been so wonderfully infused with these Korean connections and insights. And certainly thanks to my wife Hija. She's been my loving partner and supporter in all things personal and professional. And she taught me to make the ideal real, the theoretical practical, and the spiritual helpful, all in daily life. So thank you. I've been doing a lot of genealogical research, and I've been able to trace on all my lines back to about the 1600s, and they're all Bohemian Catholics. So I've reflected on how that has shaped me, given me physical existence, but also set me on a spiritual path of life, and given me exemplars of family love, endurance through adversity, and cultural flexibility and adaptability. Just as one example, my grandma Pruchova, she and her family have roots in a very small village called Przebudov in the Bohemian region of Czech Republic for more than 200 years. That is amazing stability. But she, along with some of her other siblings, but by herself when she emigrated about in 1903 at about the age of 14, I can hardly imagine this. By walking, donkey, carriage, wagon, riverboat, train, low-class steerage in terrible conditions. Took some amazing courage, and her adaptability. I think that growing up with the influence of my grandparents in particular helped shape my interest in cultural diversity and the importance of community support systems for immigrants and refugees. And on an even bigger scale, thanks to this land, to the indigenous peoples here, past and present, and all beings, this earth, and beyond. So, spiritually sensitive and culturally appropriate practice. Just a real brief summary of the strengths perspective for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So as the Dean mentioned, this is an emphasis on strengths rather than deficits and pathology. It emphasizes strengths and resources that everyone in every community has, how to identify them, how to maximize them, and to realize that even though trauma, abuse, illness, and struggle can be injurious, they also can be sources of challenge and opportunity, and that's a main theme for me tonight. We honor clients set goals and aspirations for growth and change rather than experts trying to dictate and control that. And our style of work is through collaboration. We mobilize strengths and resources of clients' relationships and environments, and all of that needs to be linked to specific doable actions, and then engage the helping process with a sense of caring and hope. I would like to tie that to a metaphor that's very important to me and to many people, That is the Lotus, and I'm going to talk about that from the perspective of the Buddhist tradition. So the Lotus is such a beautiful plant, gorgeous flower. But the Lotus' special quality is that it grows in muddy and murky water. It grows in water that is full of murk, like human existence. We have our struggles, our adversities, the things out of control, our experience of mortality. But growing out of that water, the leaf petals come up and rest on the surface, open to the light. And then a beautiful flower can come up and bloom, reaching out to the light. So it's that quality of growing up out of the condition of limitedness that actually can yield wisdom and enlightenment in our daily lives. So this budding flower, I think, is a nice example, a nice illustration of resilience and growth and beauty. But that also requires nurturance by water, earth, and sky. So that means we need to have conditions that are conducive to that growth and flourishing. So even though I'm going to be emphasizing a lot about the way in which we can change our perception and worldview to maximize our growth, this also requires the importance of social and environmental justice, because if people are simply squashed, then they cannot flower in that way. So social work is a support for this process from micro to macro levels. I'm referring to spirituality, so I'd like to say at least what I mean by it. It's an aspect of persons and groups that involves a process of human life and development with certain common themes. And my definition is specific to me, but the themes I'm presenting to you, you find in the literature across many disciplines currently. So these themes involve a search for a sense of meaning, purpose, morality, and well-being, and this occurs in the context of relationships. Yes, there's an individual and inner aspect to it, but it involves forming connections and relationships with oneself, other people, other beings, the universe, and ultimate reality, however that's understood, and there are so many different ways that can be understood. It also orients us around our significant centrally important priorities. What gives us direction? What do we want to dedicate ourselves into our lives? And it can engage a sense of transcendence, meaning carrying us beyond the sense of limitedness to an ordinary boxed-in body and ego, and possibilities to break out of that and to have experience, not just ideas about it, but experiences that leap out of that. So experiencing life as deeply profound, sacred, or transpersonal. And so spirituality can have private and public components, religious and non-religious expressions, and healthy and unhealthy manifestations. I'm going to tonight focus on healthy ways of drawing on spirituality to support growth and transformation. But that's not to neglect, unfortunately, all the horrible things that when spirituality and religion are distorted and used for discrimination and oppression. So spiritually sensitive social work supports practitioners, clients, consumers, and their communities as we all seek a sense of meaning, purpose, and connectedness, strive toward our highest aspirations, maximize strengths, resources, and developmental potential, work to overcome personal obstacles and environmental blocks, and actualize well-being and justice for all people. So that's really social work, but it's focusing on these themes that I mentioned before around spirituality that unfortunately are often neglected or ignored in conventional social work. So I would like to explain a little more what I mean by that by telling a story. Throughout most of the 1980s, most of my practice and research in workshops and training that I did related to Southeast Asian refugees. In fact, when I came here, for a job interview long ago, I presented out of that work. So that was my first interface formally with the strengths perspective here, because I was looking at the way in which the Buddhist community support systems give very important resources and supports for Southeast Asian refugees. So in this story, I was at the University of Iowa at the time, and I was working with the Bureau of Refugee Programs. I got a call from a Methodist minister, and he said, I wonder if you could help me out with something. My congregation is sponsoring 2 Lao men. They are living together as roommates, and they're having an argument. And it's getting serious. I don't know what to do. Could you come and talk to them? And I asked a little more about it. He says, well, apparently one of them's got a knife, and we're also kind of worried, is this knife going to come into play here? And we want to try to defuse this somehow. So I thought, oh, wow, this sounds like a lot of fun. Plus, I don't speak any Lao. So I worked closely with a multilingual interpreter and cultural mediator, a really wonderful person, and so she went with me. So we went together, and we met the Methodist minister there, as well as the 2 roommates. So, need to make a very long story short, as we talked, and the roommates started explaining what they were upset about, the emotional tone started to get more intense. There was getting more reactivity. You could feel the sense of irritability growing, and just non-verbally, and kind of the vibe, it was like escalating. And at a certain point, I realized my thoughts were racing. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Where's that knife? What could happen here? I'm not sure what I'm doing, and how am I going to really help? And then I realized, whoa, I made a rookie mistake. I was sitting in the room farthest away from the exit. So, if you make home visits, that's not a good position to be in. So I was getting anxious, my palms sweaty, and okay. Then suddenly, luckily, something dawned on me. I realized this couldn't keep escalating. I was running out of water, so they, as a matter of customary courtesy, they gave us water when we arrived. And so I just asked for if we could have our new glasses of water. Extremely simple, very ordinary. But what it did was break the escalation. Plus, it gave an opportunity for the roommates to just show simple kindness and politeness. So it altered the nature of the interactions that were going on. In the meantime, I could pay attention to my breath, and I could recenter and let my breath flow gently, get myself reconnected. And also for the interpreter, she was mediating not only language-wise, but the emotionality of it. So it gave her a time to break. When we all got back together, it really turned out that the roommates weren't so much angry with each other. They both had post-traumatic stress. They had gone through just absolutely horrific things with warfare and genocide in Southeast Asia, extremely dangerous flight to asylum country, long period just waiting, not knowing what would happen, finally being resettled here, dealing with the cross-cultural transition stresses, and on and on. So they were more like expressing from all of this pain and stress. So we talked about what could help, and one of the roommates said, it would help me if I could go spend some time at the local Lao Buddhist temple. Because the communities would usually in their areas, in their neighborhoods, they would, as soon as they can, marshal some resources to set up a Buddhist temple, and that became a focal point for religious and other kinds of social support. So we arranged that, and the Methodist minister said, oh, all right, I can help that. As a Methodist minister, part of my duty is to be loving and helping. If this is what is going to help, yes, I will help do that. So for the Methodist minister's point of view, the Buddhist support systems and their being completely welcomed within the Buddhist congregation were not mutually exclusive. That was a partnering arrangement. So that did work out, and luckily the knife didn't come into play, and things worked out. So what that illustrates is several important points, starting where the client is, as we always say in social work. So in this case, connect with the immediate relational conflict and resettlement-based distress through dialogue and tapping the strengths of Lao culture and Buddhist religion. And then facilitate collaboration with spiritually attuned supports, in this case both Buddhist and Methodist, that they could become complementary and linked up. But also, it's not just a matter of doing things outside, it's doing things inside. So keeping oneself clear-minded, calm, attentive, and sensitive to cues in oneself and the environment. As I described in that story, I had to recenter, become mindful myself in order to be helpful. And then working to achieve the practical goals and be open to potential for growth, to engage in respectful multicultural teamwork. And this is in the context of a huge, complex network of local, state, national, international systems involved with refugee resettlement. Some of them religiously based, some of them secular. So in order to make this one thing work, it also meant being part of encouraging a good interactional system among all of these levels. So this is, I like to make mandalas. So a mandala is a circular design that in Hindu and Buddhist traditions can assist in meditation, and they may have religious symbolism in it. But mandalas is in a kind of general design element, helps to represent how different things could be connected in a holistic manner. So this is a mandala I use for this ideal of transculturality. The different colored circles relating to different cultural, spiritual worldview positions that we need to link up in a manner of respect, competence, comfort, and humility. But also we need to find a center point. So there's some common connections among different people and different groups and different positions. Some of that, you might say, is simply common cause. Some of it is identifying shared goals and working on them together. Some of it is commonalities that we all have as human beings. So there are many different languages, but we are all languaging. If we pay attention to that, that helps us realize across the language differences there are certain common communicational points. But on a deeper level, I think it also means we can reflect on, metaphorically, I'd call it a common heart, our common human-heartedness. If we go inside ourselves very sincerely and experience our deeper, truer self, we can experience not just an idea, not just some kind of a philosophical teaching about it, but we can get a sense that we have an inherent connectedness with everyone and even all beings. So if we have that sense, it really helps us as we're working to connect on a more practical level across these differences. So social workers, to do this, I think it means a constant process of cultivation. This is not easy. This is a lifelong process. I'm retiring and I'm not done with it. It's a constant process. So the outer circle on this diagram for me represents a comprehensive, inclusive mode of consciousness and behavior and teamwork that can include and transcend multiple perspectives. And really that story I told about with the Lao roommates reflects that. So I want to expand that, those values to something I developed recently. So I think your packet might have a discount flyer for my most recent book. Besides that being a plug, hey, you get a pretty good price if you're interested in the book. And that book presents a lot of details about far more than I can present this evening. But one of the things that I put new in that edition is principles for inclusive compassion and justice. These are inspired by many sources, including capabilities theory, and I wanted to thank Professor Banerjee because she helped me learn about that. And interfaith and interreligious collaborations for world peace and justice. I mentioned some of those sources there. So in a broad sense, these principles involve supporting full human development, prioritizing the vulnerable, and honoring global and ecological connectedness, and respecting spiritual diversity, both religious and non-religious. So I fleshed that out more in the book, but what I'd like to share with you here is something related. I thought a lot about what this might mean in terms of promoting respect and caring at different system levels, and how it's different from common mistakes we make, we collectively. We want to promote respect and caring for the dignity, worth, and rights of each person, but that's not the same as promoting egotistic individualism. We want to promote dignity, worth, and the rights of families, but that's not the same as encouraging nepotistic familism. We want to promote the integrity of ethnic, cultural, and religious communities, but that's not the same as supporting ethnocentrism, racism, and religious exclusivism. We want to encourage the solidarity and sovereignty of indigenous nations and nation states, and that's certainly not the same as colonialism, imperialism, genocide, chauvinistic nationalism, and totalitarianism, which unfortunately is all too often the mode of operating. We also want to promote respect and caring for the earth, its ecosystems, and the worldwide community of human beings and all beings. That is also not the same as world region bias, global north privilege, humanocentrism, destruction of nature, or environmental racism. And finally, maybe not really finally, but putting it on the biggest scale, promoting respect and caring for everything and everywhere humans traverse, for all beings. So actually, we know humans aren't limited to the earth anymore, right? I haven't heard social work talk about, interplanetary yet, but we better. We're trashing the atmosphere and beyond the atmosphere with a bunch of satellites and military death equipment and all sorts of awful stuff. And the plans in the works for Mars and the moon are not all benign. So I would like to suggest we pay attention. Actually, a long time ago, like 40 years ago, somebody at a social work agency said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I'd like to be the first interplanetary social worker." But actually, it didn't go over so well with that guy. I was ahead of my time, I guess. All right, next part. Growth through chronic illness and disability. I'm going to use the example of cystic fibrosis. So CF, as a medical condition, is genetically based. It has many different kinds of effects, but in particular it damages the lungs and pancreas and other systems with mucus-like secretions. More than 30,000 people in the U.S. have CF. The average lifespan now is about 37 years, and that's actually a huge increase. So CF is treatable, but it's not presently curable. Although recently there's some amazing treatment breakthroughs, even literally in the last 10 days, you might have seen in the press. There's some amazing new therapies, drug therapies that look promising for possibly about 90% of people with CF. So people with CF, commonly it requires daily extensive use of antibiotics, digestive enzymes, respiratory clearance therapies, hospitalizations as needed, and other treatments. So I mentioned a little bit of background so you get the idea. If you're not familiar with it, this is a significant life-impacting condition. Many of you know, because knowing me personally or through my professional work and advocacy, that I also have CF. So that piqued my interest, in terms of my not only personal life, but professional work. So some of my research was really looking at, based on my experience and one of my brothers who had CF, and he and I talked a lot about philosophical and spiritual matters over the years, so that kind of made me interested in how other people with CF deal with this. So I want to really take the main focus on this, main insight, as working even with a very difficult condition like that can be an opportunity also for growth and transformation. In fact, all experience can be a medium for creative shaping and expressing life. So I like to think of life itself as an artistic project. Here is a picture of it's actually a large sculpture that is hanging on a wall by Dylan Mortimer, who's a pastor who has CF, and he's an artist, and his artwork is exhibited in many places. He has used the experience of CF to also inform his artwork. So this is a quote from him. "Creating artwork has been my pushback against being given a deadly diagnosis at birth. Mortimer says it's a search for healing in the seemingly incurable, for hope in seeming hopelessness. I draw inspiration from God, my donor, friends, and family, doctors, caretakers, scientists, and all who have helped keep me alive." And if you're interested through this website, and if you just Google his name, you can find a lot of interesting things about his work. But for me, the larger point I'd like to bring from this is not only literally making art, but making life art. It's a couple of other illustrations. Lisa McDonough was an essayist. She wrote essays for a newsletter for adults with CF for a long time. She said, "What has also become healing for me is to realize that our bodies are not objects, but ongoing stories. The flesh is the timeline of the soul, its companion, not its competitor. What can make owning or finding our story difficult is when CF is perceived only as a tragedy, rather than an opportunity or a process of discovery." I mentioned that I had a brother with CF. He passed away in 1991. In one of his essays, he said this: "Sometimes I thank the Lord for CF. There are times when the positive thought comes to mind, what if I were born Tom but without cystic fibrosis?" A lot of people would say, hey, that'd be good. But might seem a bit strange. He says, "I believe the answer to that question would be that I would be nearly at a total loss. I believe that CF has made me angry enough to demand some tough answers." So it was like a fuel to ask deep questions about life. So initially, going back to the early 90s, Dr. Stern and another physician, Dr. Stern was my CF specialist for like 45 years. That's absolutely fantastic to have that relationship for so long. And we put together our interests in this research project back when it was very rare, the topic was very rare in the medical field. So we interviewed all 402 patients at a major CF treatment center or their guardians, and exploring what he was calling non-medically prescribed treatments and therapies. And what we found was that at least one type was reported by 66% of the patients. That's probably an underreport. Because now, but especially then, many people would be cautious about telling physicians what they're doing if it doesn't fit the prescriptions or the conventional thinking. And of these, more than 2/3 related to spiritual practices and beliefs, like individual prayer, group prayer, or prayer chains. Prayer chains means like someone in a congregation lets their fellow congregants know someone is sick, they would like prayers, and then it goes across a chain of like a big support network. Faith healing, use of healing objects like a religious medal worn on the body, meditation, and most reported benefits like relief of symptoms, sense of comfort, enhancement of well-being. And by the way, these were a lot cheaper than the medical prescribed treatments. So then I thought, what is that about more deeply? Because the survey just was, hitting the surface. So I interviewed 16 adults for the survey for whom spirituality was important, and included myself in the study. That's a long story how I did that, but I trained my transcriptionist to interview me using the same protocol and included that in the analysis. So anyway, what I found quite interesting, it made sense to me, but I don't know that I'd heard this in the research exactly before. When we asked about the impact of CF on different life domains, in the physical domain, no surprise, almost everything described was negative. And I told you about some of the physical problems that may come up. The mental domain, meaning thoughts and feelings triggered by having CF, also mostly negative, like sadness, anxiety, troubling thoughts, anger. The social domain was more mixed of both positive and negative. Negative included impeding social relations and work performance, but positive included a sense that by being in touch with their own experience of difficulty and suffering and coming through that, it heightened their sense of empathy and their desire to be empathically connected with other people and to care for other people. Then what was really interesting when we talked about the spiritual domain, it completely flipped from the physical domain. Most reported positive impacts, like by working with the issues brought up by having CF, gaining insight into the meaning of life, drawing closer to God or deepening in their spiritual practice, believing God uses them to help inspire others, and using challenges to stimulate personal and spiritual growth. So this involved things like prayer, reducing physical symptoms or discomfort. All of the activities promoted an overall positive outlook and reduced a sense of confusion and painful feelings. Cultivating a relationship with a higher power or some other source of sacredness or significance. And religious group participation, these things also affected, in a good way, social benefits because of the community connections they formed through it. And many described what they called miraculous or extraordinary events, things that broke out of the ordinary way of thinking about the limits of the body and the ego, like physical improvements, sensing the presence of God or angels, and having meaningful dreams, visions, and apparitions. So I'll tell you a couple of stories. Joan was waiting for a lung transplant. And during this period when both she and her husband were very stressed out and worried, she had this intense dream. She and her husband were on a boat in a lake. A storm came up, and it became very threatening weather. They were worried about the boat capsizing and drowning. Now, these were devout Christians. So actually, this is very similar to a New Testament story, if you're familiar with this. The picture that I have here is from the New Testament story in which Jesus comes in to comfort the disciples on a boat. So anyway, this experience was very intense. When she woke up, it was like, wow, this not only means something, it not only symbolizes the situation, but she had a very powerful, vivid sense of divine presence with her. And she said afterwards there was an ongoing angelic presence she could feel with her, even when she went in for the lung transplant. She said, we really could feel the supernatural strength all the way up through the transplant. There is no real fear there. If I died on the table, I said, that's okay. It's not a bad thing. Sometimes I'm very moved by recounting this. So actually, when my brother passed away, Heej and I went home to my parents' house. We were very close. Interesting thing happened to me during the night. I felt someone tap my leg, and I looked up, and there was my brother. So not his body, but a sense of his presence. And he just conveyed, I'm okay. I love you, and I'm okay. That was beautiful. So also, by the way, I want to say, why do I tell stories like this, even personal stories? And I do that partly because I think in conventional society and in classrooms and in social work academic settings, we often wall those things off. And I want people to have a sense that this is not only normal, but can be wonderful, and it's okay to talk about it. And if we don't get comfortable with it, it's going to be hard to be comfortable with our clients who are talking about it. And it's not about trying to convince anybody, did this really happen or not, in some scientific sense. The important thing is the experienced reality of it. What is the meaning of it to the person? And how that, in fact, this is not unusual. If in the area of bereavement, people often talk about these kinds of experiences, and that can become a tremendous strength in their bereavement process and ongoing life. So I asked participants, what suggestions do you have for professional helpers? And these very well fit with the strengths perspective. Identify and support the client's spirituality if it's important to them, in whatever way makes sense to them, not to you, the provider. Individualized treatment plans, encourage home-based care or social supports, promote a positive attitude, support the client in their search for a sense of purpose in life. Most of the participants that I interviewed talked about struggling against CF like it was an enemy. Actually, I don't feel that way, but that's how most of them, they use metaphors like that. So we may need to support people in their struggle, but also when it's time to let go into dying. So we also need to be fully present and respectful with the client as a whole person. And this is the big context picture. Ensure treatments are affordable and accessible. Without that, people simply aren't going to be alive to engage in this kind of growth process. So I thought about, not only from my studies, but many other studies, many studies that look at how people can respond to acute illness, crises, trauma, disaster, and other life disruptions in a growth-oriented, transformative way. What's that about? And the common word that we're using a lot in our field is resilience. But resilience literally means springing back. All right, that's okay, but it doesn't have to be only springing back. The very fact that there's this incredible challenge can be an opportunity for springing forward or beyond, going into something new. So also it's not just about recovering, going back to a pre-crisis condition. Not only surviving and coping, but some people grow and thrive through adversity and even shift into a transformational creative way of living through all the ups, downs, and smooth times of life. So I've just tried out the term transilience for this. And by that I mean it's a developmental leap of transcendence. It's a whole person process of growing on a life path that's committed to well-being and well-becoming. And it breaks through conventional ideas about health, illness, fitness, strength, goodness, ability, or disability. All that stuff is made up. I don't mean to say that the challenges and conditions are made up, but all the ways of labeling and thinking and interpreting is made up. We have the possibility to become liberated from that. So transilience transforms daily life, its joys, doldrums, and challenges, including experiences of adversity, illness, and dying, into a pathway for growth. I'm just going to mention this to you for your later interest if you want. Through the handout, you have some links to work that I've done more recently on mental health, recovery, and spirituality. And I just want to share something I think is nice as a representation of what I'm talking about here. Several years ago, I co-organized a conference on spirituality and mental health recovery, and part of it involved an art show. So people provided, among other things, drawings depicting. So on the left here, there's a drawing of a journey from fear to love. So on the left side, the large word fear, a big staring eyeball, exploding volcanoes, a dry desert. Doesn't sound fun at all. On the right side, the word love, a heart, mountains, a flourishing tree. And so for this artist, he was depicting that his recovery process, it's not just about symptoms. There is a transition in a whole way of life. The picture on the right is showing hands folded in prayer, and there's a rosary weaving through the fingers, but each bead of the rosary is a medication pill. I think that's really, really cool. So for her, it's not a matter of some kind of a split or dichotomy between conventional medicine and her spiritual practice, but by fusing them, it made them actually both more potent. And by the way, the CSWE has an online resource that shows the exhibit, and also has a teaching guideline for how to use that in classes if you're interested. Also, for later, if you're interested, you can see something more practical, a tool on spiritual strengths assessment that we developed in collaboration with providers and consumers. I won't go over that now, but I just want you to be aware of it, and you can access it free from my website. And on these slides, I've extracted some main questions, examples. It's very simple, but believe me, to get it to that simple was not easy. The idea is somebody doesn't have to be a specialist in spirituality or this or that, but how to engage in a dialogue with people, to open the topic, identify strengths and resources, set up an action plan, and really help mobilize that. So, I've suggested there is this approach to life that's growth and transformationally oriented. What might help us to cultivate that? And I think one thing that can be very helpful is mindfulness. And mindfulness is, probably all of you know, has become, in the last 10 years, hugely influential in social work, health, mental health, and many other fields. So I'd like to say a little bit about that. And to start, this is kind of a little mindfulness experience that I had before I even knew the term. When I was in high school, I spent a lot of time walking in the woods, a lot of time by myself, and just making connections with the places, with specific trees, with the creek, and I mean, it was just wonderful. But anyway, one fall I was walking through a field, and I saw this maple tree that was just spectacularly beautiful, something like a picture that I have up there. Glorious colors, and I thought, that's perfect. Oh, that is just perfect beauty. That is so wonderful. So I went up closer, and I looked at each of the leaves, and I look at this leaf. What's this? Oh, there's all these stains and grungy marks, and another leaf, there's insect borings, and there's holes, and there's rips, and there's tears. Every leaf was like that. But it's all of that together that produced that beauty. So it helped break out of the idea of, beauty as though it's all nicey nice or perfect or something. But life itself, with all of its variety, including its messiness, can be an experience of beauty. So one time walking through Prague, I ran across these two things that related to attitudes towards death, and it really struck me. On the left side, there's a picture of this sculpture. It's a huge skull kind of crushing this person down on his back. On the right side, there's a picture of this puppeteer who's working with the marionette strings on this skeleton figure playing a piano and having fun. So I was kind of thinking, which point of view do I want to take? What do I prefer? I rather not take the one where I'm just feeling crushed down by mortality and death. How about the more playful attitude? And I'd like to just pull out from a few different religious and philosophical traditions some other musings, themes along these lines. So in Christianity, of course, the story of the death and resurrection of Christ is central. If you've looked at the different accounts of that, they're not all the same if you look across the Gospels. So Mark has a phrase, this is while Jesus is on the cross, "Lord, why have you forsaken me?" And then Luke adds, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Those are two different stances. The third one is after in the story when Jesus is written and meets his disciples, he says, "Peace be with you." So actually those three insights, if you put them together, to me they're quite significant. And in the Christian tradition, this yields a lot, but one is the ideal of caritas, which means, often in English we translate as charity, but it means non-egoistic love. Another thing is that the concept about death is not necessarily a termination, but death of the self is an opening to spiritual rebirth, even while alive. And that's a lot of what I've been talking about. The death of an old or limiting self or view of the world can become a new birth into something else. So in John's famous quote, "You must be born anew." And I have a picture here of a street mural from Chicago of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I grew up with this image quite a bit. It's common in Catholicism. So it's showing Jesus with his heart exposed, and the heart is brilliant, but it's lit up with flames and it's burning. So this means a kind of intense, compassionate love. So, I was thinking sometimes, I haven't heard the expression so much lately, but I used to hear it a lot. People who are criticizing people who have values probably kind of like me and you. "You're bleeding heart liberals." And I thought, hey, well, if we use this imagery of the Sacred Heart, maybe that's not so bad. So, in the Catholic tradition, there's something called the Dance of Death. If any of you are into classical music, you might know Franz Liszt's famous piano piece called the Totentanz, which is German, means dance of death. So during the period of plagues and massive deaths in Europe, the church presented even like booklets and ways to help reflect on mortality and death and how to come to terms with it. One of those is the Dance of Death theme. So one time I was visiting with an Austrian friend at a chapel in Germany, and there was a display of something like around 24 paintings. Each one depicted, at the time, at that historical point, some kind of figure in society dancing with a skeletal figure, the image of death. And the idea was everybody, no matter what your station was, literally it had from peasant to emperor and pope, everybody had to dance with death. But that's not all saying it's something bad. It's a dance. So the last painting is of the artist, Jakob Hebler. And the poem there says, "Now it's time for the artist to dance with death. I've done the paintings. Now it's time for me also to do that dance." So I had a close friend who was a retreat director and spiritual mentor. She lived her whole life dedicated as a path of growth and helping and service to other people. Unfortunately, she developed a very aggressive form of cancer, and she died within, I think, 3 weeks of the diagnosis. That was intense. That was terrible, just terrible. Just terrible. But she took her whole lifetime of way of approaching her experience as an opportunity for growth and applied it to that. Not only like at LMH, setting up in her palliative care room an altar with important symbols, having music, friends visiting. A lot of what we did was just sitting quietly. She was a contemplative. It's not a matter of finding a solution or soothing sometimes by talking, just by the presence of caring and loving quietly. So with her friends, the medical care providers all help make that a sacred space and support her experience of death. So here's another Dancing with Death theme. This is from a very different tradition. This is a famous monk from Korean history. He was on a journey to China, hoping to study with some great Buddhist masters. Along the way, there was a heavy rain. He took shelter in a cave, and it became very dark. So he decided, well, might as well go to sleep. But he woke up, and when it was really dark, he couldn't really see, but he felt like, man, I am so thirsty. I got to get something to drink. So he felt around in the dark. He found a bowl, and he collected some water in it, and he drank. Oh, that was so wonderful. My thirst is quenched. Lay down, go to sleep, wake up in the morning, feeling good, and then he looked around. Where's that bowl? It turned out to be a human skull cap. Oh my gosh, how disgusting. I drank out of a human skull cap. And then, wait a minute. It's the same. The only thing different is I put a different interpretation and reaction to it. So he realized, he woke up to the way in which how his mind portrayed something, made it good or bad. And instead, just appreciating what it actually is. I'm running out of time, my goodness. So I think what I'm going to do is skip some more of these. I have more things along this theme from other traditions. Lao Tzu makes the interesting point, a lot of people complain about misery and misfortune in the human condition and things going wrong with your body. But if you didn't have a body, none of that stuff would happen. So what are you knocking? Confucius emphasized life itself as a continuous process of learning. And when you do really learn, when you grasp the Tao, or the cosmic way of life, the benevolent way of living, a very powerful phrase, if one hears the way or the Tao in the morning, one can die content in the evening. So this is a approach to life that I think mindfulness practice can help to support. So mindfulness, just to make this part very brief, it involves learning how to develop clear awareness of self and environment in the present moment to moment, non-judgmentally, with a kind attitude. So what that does is something pretty amazing. It opens a space in your consciousness between an initial experience and your reaction to the experience. So often what we do is something happens to us and we react according to whatever our habits of mind and behavior are. And it might be helpful, it might be harmful, it might get us into a heap of trouble. It might just compound our problems because we're ruminating, we're complaining to ourselves. Oh, it's horrible, woe is me. And the more you keep doing that, the more suffering you have. So if you can just let that stuff go like a bubble, just let it pop, and be to just the experience itself. You may experience, oh my gosh, I just got the diagnosis of this horrible illness. I remember when I did. Oh my God. What's that mean? But between that and the response to it, with mindfulness, you don't simply have an automatic reaction, but even whatever your reaction is, you can notice it non-judgmentally, let it go, and connect in the present moment with just what is. That removes, it doesn't magically make the situation go away, but what it does remove is all the unnecessary suffering that you built up around it. And it allows you to make a choice about how to respond. But I don't mean this is one time. I mean this is like a continuous process of choice points and decisions. So mindfulness is a ongoing cultivation process. Later, if you're interested, you could look some more at some slides that I have about how to promote mindfulness practices without cultural misappropriation and distortion. So here on this slide, the two images here are the difference between pain and suffering I was just alluding to. Pain is just pain. If I accidentally touch a hot pot on the stove, I sure want to get the message that it's hot. Pain is not our enemy. Now, sometimes we can have chronic pain, we need treatment, and we need to get rid of it because it's not giving useful messages, and it's very difficult. But pain itself is not a problem. But what we add to the pain, our reactions to pain, I don't want to have the pain. Why is the pain continuing? I want it to stop. I'm so upset. Oh, I took this workshop where I learned how I was supposed to relax and be at peace with the pain, but I'm really infuriated. What's wrong with me? So you just keep adding all of these layers of complexity and suffering to it. But when you let it go and just be in touch with what it is, the interesting thing is even the physical pain can reduce. So I would like to actually just give some concluding insights. So I have a picture here of something that many of you might not realize is actually the university seal. The university seal has the image of Moses and the burning bush. We don't see it around publicly too much anymore. But when I first came here, actually, that could be one of the things, choice on our business card. So anyway, this story about Moses is really interesting. And here are some themes that I'll draw out of it. So first of all, summarizing what I've been saying, life disruption can be an opportunity for life transformation. This requires choice, perseverance, support, and resources. It can even become a life way of continuous growth and wisdom and fulfillment, and might even involve opening up to a sacred mystery that's beyond human meaning making. And this symbol kind of gets at that. So then the story about Moses in Exodus, Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock, and he came to Mount Horeb. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames from a bush, but the bush wasn't burning up. That was pretty amazing. So he's attracted, he's fascinated, he comes close. What is going on? That's one feature that can be when you have a very profound experience. Like, it's fascinating. You want to get closer to it. But when it's really intense, in the original meaning of awesome, not the watered-down meaning, awestruck means you're like overwhelmed. You can become shocked. It can even be frightening. So that was the other part of this. Moses was trying to figure out what was this about, and out of the bush, the Lord says, I am who am, which is not easily translated actually into English, but it goes beyond like ordinary names and labels. So Moses took off his shoes and hid his face, afraid to look. And then eventually, as part of this dialogue, the Lord tells him to bring the people out of bondage in Egypt. So I think the ingredients here of the story kind of fit with my main message. To be open to profundity in daily life. If it's not actually a burning bush, maybe it's just while you're washing dishes. Approach life with humility. experience the mystery that can even be beyond human knowing, names and forms, that can inflame life with wisdom and infuse a sense of purpose. And in any case, apply your insight and vitality to helpful and liberatory action in service to others. Well, that's all I got.